7th of August, 1944. A damp, grey dawn was breaking over the shattered landscape of Normandy near the town of Mortain. At precisely 6:47 hours, General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Lüttwitz, a man whose aristocratic bearing seemed at odds with the mud on his boots, stood at his forward command post. The general, commanding the formidable 2. SS Panzerdivision Das Reich, raised his Zeiss 10 by 50 binoculars to his eyes, the cold metal a familiar weight in his hands. Before him, spread out across the patchwork of country lanes and hedgerow-lined fields, the infamous Bocage was the mailed fist of Germany's last great gamble in France. 175 panzers and armored vehicles were arrayed for battle, the spearhead of the Mortain counteroffensive. There were Panzer IVs, their boxy hulls hugging the earth, the sleek, sloped armor of the Panthers, the unmistakable, brutish silhouette of the Tigers, and columns of SD KFZ. 251 half-tracks, their bellies full of grim-faced Panzer Grenadiers. It was a formidable sight, a concentration of armor not seen since the opening days of the Normandy campaign. This was Operation Lüttich, an offensive ordered personally by the Führer against the strenuous objections of his field marshals. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal, to punch through the thinly held American lines at Mortain, drive west to the coast at Avranches, and sever the supply lines of General Patton's Third Army, which was at that moment threatening to encircle the entire German Seventh Army. Von Lüttwitz, a professional soldier to his core, knew the plan was born of desperation. Yet, orders were orders. His division had been bolstered overnight, bringing his operational panzer strength to 89, supported by elements of 3 other panzer divisions. He glanced at his wristwatch. In 13 minutes, the coordinated assault would begin. His greatest ally, for now, was the weather. For 3 consecutive days, a thick, cloying morning fog had blanketed Normandy, often lingering until 9 or 10 in the morning. This fog had been a godsend, grounding the Allies' dreaded Jabos, the fighter bombers that had wreaked such havoc upon German columns for the past month. The Royal Air Force, in particular, had become masters of this deadly art. If the fog held for just another 3 hours, von Lüttwitz calculated, his panzers could well reach Avranches before the RAF could effectively intervene. The fate of the entire German army in France rested on a blanket of water vapor. But then, at 6:52, a mere 8 minutes before H hour, something changed. Von Lüttwitz felt it first on his cheek, a subtle shift in the air, a light but persistent breeze stirring from the west. The dense curtain of fog began to stir, to writhe and swirl like a disturbed spirit. Wisps detached themselves from the main bank, revealing brief, tantalizing glimpses of the green fields beyond. Within a quarter of an hour, the impossible had happened. Visibility had stretched from a scant 200 yards to well over a mile. The sun, a pale disk moments before, was now beginning to burn through, promising a clear, bright summer's day. A knot of ice formed in the pit of von Lüttwitz's stomach. He snatched the handset of his field radio. "All battalion commanders," he barked, his voice tight with urgency, "proceed with extreme caution. Maintain maximum dispersal. Expect enemy air activity." But it was already far too late. The sky was opening up, and he knew, with a soldier's grim certainty, what was coming. 115 miles away, on the tarmac of RAF Herne near Bournemouth, the air thrummed with a very different kind of energy. The pilots of No. 263 Squadron, Royal Air Force, were already strapped into the cockpits of their Hawker Typhoons. The throaty, complex roar of their 2,180 horsepower Napier Sabre engines echoed across the airfield, a sound of immense, barely contained power. Flight Lieutenant John Baldwin, leader of Yellow Section, had been roused from his bunk in a cold Nissen hut at 5:30 with the news. A terse briefing in the operations room, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and strong tea, laid out the situation: a major German counteroffensive at Mortain. The final words from the wing commander still rang in his ears: "We need every available Tiffy in the air as soon as the weather breaks. This is a maximum effort." Baldwin was no stranger to this work. With 47 sorties over France in the last 2 months, the cockpit of his Typhoon felt more like home than his quarters. He knew his aircraft intimately. The Tiffy wasn't a graceful, thoroughbred interceptor like the Spitfire or Mustang. It was a beast of burden, a rugged, powerful fighter bomber built for one specific, brutal task: to hunt and kill armored targets on the ground. His Typhoon, call sign MN526, was armed for the job. Slung under each wing on steel rails were 4 60-pound RP-3 rockets. Each rocket, a simple steel tube packed with cordite, carried a 60-pound high-explosive warhead capable of punching through 5 inches of armor plate on a direct hit. The pilots had a gallows humor saying about the RP-3, the hitting power of a naval destroyer's shell, the accuracy of throwing a brick over your shoulder. It wasn't far from the truth. The rockets were notoriously inaccurate. At a typical firing range of 1,000 yards, a rocket could easily stray 50 yards from the point of aim. Most pilots considered a direct hit on a single tank to be a matter of pure luck. But what the weapon lacked in precision, it more than made up for in sheer, overwhelming firepower and the profound psychological terror it induced. At 7:05, the voice of the controller crackled in Baldwin's headset, the clipped, calm tones of southern England cutting through the engine's roar. All Typhoon flights, you are cleared for scramble. Target coordinates grid reference Mortain. Over 100 enemy armored vehicles reported in the area. Priority is maximum. Free hunt. Out. Baldwin's hand moved to the throttle, pushing the lever smoothly forward. The Napier Sabre engine screamed in response. The Typhoon, heavy with fuel and ordnance, surged down the runway, gathering speed with frightening rapidity before lifting into the now clear morning air. Behind him, 15 more Tiffies from 263 Squadron took to the sky in a disciplined, rapid stream. All along the south coast of England and from newly laid advanced landing grounds in Normandy itself, dozens more squadrons were doing the same. No. 181 Squadron, 193 Squadron, 197, 257, 266. The air was filling with the sound of hornets. The largest concentration of Typhoon fighter bombers ever assembled against a single target was converging on one small sector of the Normandy front. Flight time from England, 22 minutes. At 7:27, Baldwin crossed the French coast, the white cliffs of Normandy a stark contrast to the green fields beyond. He eased the stick forward, descending to 4,000 feet. Below him, the battlefield was laid out like a colossal, tragic map. The hedgerows of the bocage carved the landscape into 1,000 tiny squares. Plumes of smoke rose from shattered villages. And on the meandering country roads, he saw them. Tanks. Dozens and dozens of German tanks, crawling westwards like a plague of steel beetles. Yellow leader to yellow section. Tally-ho. Armor visual, 2 o'clock, range 3 miles. Forming up for attack. Going down now. Baldwin rolled the big fighter onto its port wing and pushed the nose down into a steep dive. The airspeed indicator needle climbed rapidly past 300 miles per hour, then 350. The whine of the wind over the canopy intensified to a shriek. The German tanks swelled in his reflector gun sight. He could pick them out now, a Panther with its long, elegant 75mm gun, 2 smaller, boxier Panzer IVs, and their, unmistakable with its massive 88mm cannon and slab-sided hull, a Tiger. At 3,000 feet and a horizontal distance of about a mile, Baldwin's thumb flicked the rocket arming switch to live. He steadied the dive, placing the gun sight's glowing pipper slightly above the Tiger. The RP-3s were unguided, simple tubes of metal and explosive. Once fired, they accelerated to over 1,000 miles per hour in 1.5 seconds, then followed an erratic ballistic path governed by wind, aircraft speed, dive angle, and sheer bloody chance. But Baldwin, over the course of 47 brutal missions, had developed a feel for it. He held the dive angle at a steady 30 degrees, airspeed precisely 350 miles per hour. He knew the sweet spot for release was between 900 and 1,000 yards. Point the nose high to compensate for the rocket's drop, and fire in pairs, or ripples, to spread the damage. At 950 yards, his thumb depressed the firing button. With a distinct whoosh, 2 rockets detached from the rails under his starboard wing, leaving twin trails of thick white smoke as they streaked towards the ground. 2 seconds later, he fired a second pair from his port wing. Immediately, he hauled back hard on the stick, the Typhoon shuddering as it pulled out of the dive, the heavy G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. The first rule of a TIFI attack was to get away from the target as fast as possible to avoid the inevitable storm of ack. He risked a quick glance over his shoulder. The first rocket struck the ground 10 yards short of the Tiger, erupting in a geyser of black earth and shrapnel. The second impacted between the Tiger and a Panzer IV, gouging a crater 6 feet wide. The third overshot the tanks completely, detonating harmlessly in a hedgerow 30 yards beyond. But the fourth rocket flew true. It struck the Tiger's frontal glacis plate squarely. The 60-pound warhead detonated against the 100 millimeters of Krupp steel with a brilliant flash of orange that Baldwin could see clearly from 2,000 feet. A ball of fire was followed by a plume of dense, oily black smoke. But to his utter disbelief, the Tiger kept moving. The thick frontal armor had held. The rocket had likely stunned the crew and left a fearsome dent, but it hadn't penetrated. Baldwin cursed into his oxygen mask. A direct hit, and the damned thing was still running. But then, something else happened. The other 3 Typhoons of his section were now screaming down in their own attack dives, their approaches staggered by seconds. A flurry of rocket trails converged on the German column. In the space of 10 seconds, another 24 RP-3s rained down on the small formation of panzers. For the men on the ground, the experience was utterly different. Inside the Tiger that had taken the hit, Obersturmführer Klaus Baumann was still trying to clear the ringing from his ears when his loader screamed, "More J-bows." 3 o'clock. Baumann peered through his periscope and saw a sight that would be seared into his memory forever. The sky was filled with white smoke trails, all converging on his position like the fingers of a skeletal hand. The high-pitched, banshee shriek of the incoming rockets was a sound unlike any other, a noise that promised imminent, violent death. Out. Everybody out. Abandon tank. The crew needed no second telling. The driver was already wrenching his hatch open. The gunner scrambled out of the turret, and the loader practically shoved Baumann out ahead of him. They tumbled from the steel beast and sprinted for the relative safety of a ditch 60 feet away. 3 seconds later, 2 rockets struck the Tiger almost simultaneously. One hit the engine deck at the rear, punching through the thinner 28 mm armor and detonating within the engine compartment. The other slammed into the right-hand track, shattering it completely. The 57-ton behemoth was instantly immobilized and engulfed in flames. It was now nothing more than a smoking, blackened hulk. But the attack had only just begun. From his command post, von Lüttwitz watched in pure horror as the sky above his division filled with Typhoons. It wasn't 4 or 5 aircraft, it was dozens upon dozens. They came in flights of 4, attacking in relentless, continuous waves. Each wave unleashed 32 rockets, climbed away, circled, and came back for another pass with their 20 mm cannons. Post-war calculations would estimate that between 7:27 and 14:30 that day, some 450 sorties were flown against the German forces near Mortain. That equated to thousands of RP-3 rockets, a literal rain of high explosive falling from the sky for 7 solid hours. The effect was not merely physical, it was profoundly psychological. The German soldiers who survived described it as hell on earth. The constant, terrifying shriek of the rockets, the deafening explosions, the crisscrossing smoke trails that painted the sky, the utter impossibility of predicting where the next salvo would land, it created a sense of complete helplessness. There was no effective shelter, no escape, only blind, random chance. Panic, a far more effective weapon than any high explosive, began to spread through the elite Panzer Division. Tank crews, abandoning their perfectly functional vehicles, bailed out and fled for the woods. Half-track drivers leapt from their cabins, leaving their vehicles blocking the roads. Entire platoons lost radio contact with their commanders. Battalions began to disintegrate as organized fighting units. Von Lüttwitz tried desperately to restore order. He commanded his remaining operational panzers to disperse and seek cover beneath the trees. He radioed frantically for Luftwaffe fighter cover, but the response was what he had expected, none was available. The Luftwaffe had long since lost control of the skies over Normandy. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were being systematically slaughtered by the swarms of Allied Spitfires, Tempests, and Mustangs that now roamed at will. At 9:15, less than 2 hours after the aerial onslaught began, von Lüttwitz sent a coded message to the headquarters of the XLVII Panzer Corps. Enemy air attack of unprecedented intensity. Severe losses in vehicles and personnel. Request permission to withdraw to defensive positions. The reply came swiftly, not from Corps, but from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht itself. Denied. The Führer orders the attack to continue regardless of losses. Von Lüttwitz read the signal, his face a mask of stone. He folded the piece of paper, tucked it into his tunic pocket, and went about the impossible task of trying to save what was left of his division. By 14:30, as the last Typhoons turned for their bases in England and Normandy to rearm and refuel, the battlefield around Mortain resembled a graveyard of armor. The initial reports claimed a staggering victory. The final tally was devastating: 175 German armored vehicles claimed destroyed or abandoned. 89 panzers knocked out. The 2. SS Panzerdivision Das Reich had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Yet the full story of the Mortain attack is more complex than these triumphant numbers suggest. After the war, the sharp minds of the Air Ministry's operational research sections conducted a painstaking forensic analysis of the battlefield, examining the wreckage of every German vehicle to determine the true effectiveness of the RP-3 rocket. Their findings were astonishing. Of the 175 vehicles claimed as destroyed by the Typhoons, only 9 showed conclusive evidence of being knocked out by a direct hit from an RP-3 rocket. 9. Barely 5% of the total. So what accounted for the other 166 vehicles? The answer reveals a deeper truth about modern warfare. Sometimes, the psychological effect of a weapon is infinitely more devastating than its direct physical impact. The overwhelming majority of German vehicles at Mortain were abandoned by their terrified crews, not destroyed by direct hits. These crews, broken by the hours of relentless bombardment, fled from perfectly operational machines, leaving them strewn across the battlefield. Many of these abandoned vehicles were later destroyed by American artillery, or were simply captured after running out of fuel when German supply columns could no longer reach them. Others were disabled by near misses that damaged tracks, optics, or radios, rendering them combat ineffective. But the end result was the same: 175 armored vehicles were removed from the German order of battle. The Mortain counteroffensive had collapsed. Hitler's last chance to alter the course of the war in France had been shattered from the air. Was the RP-3 the miracle weapon Allied propaganda proclaimed? Not exactly. But was it brutally effective in achieving its military objective? Absolutely. The rocket attacks at Mortain represented a new paradigm in close air support, massive area of effect saturation combined with overwhelming psychological shock. The rockets didn't need to be precise if you could fire enough of them to blanket an area and terrify the enemy into paralysis. It was the military doctrine of quantity has a quality all its own, applied to aerial ordnance. And it worked. After Mortain, the German High Command became increasingly reluctant to concentrate its panzer forces for large-scale offensives, knowing such formations would be instant magnets for swarms of rocket-firing Typhoons and Thunderbolts. German armored operations became smaller, more cautious, and largely confined to the hours of darkness. General Heinrich von Lüttwitz survived Mortain and continued to command panzer units until the war's end. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote extensively about the 7th of August, 1944, describing it as the day I knew with certainty that we had lost the war. It wasn't the tactical defeat itself. The Wehrmacht had suffered tactical defeats before and recovered. It was the stark realization that the enemy now possessed the ability to concentrate overwhelming firepower at any point on the battlefield in a matter of minutes. That Allied air supremacy was so total they could operate with virtual impunity. Von Lüttwitz wrote, "I watched as the sky above my division grew dark with enemy aircraft, like a plague of locusts. I watched as 175 vehicles for which we had fought and bled were destroyed or abandoned in 7 hours. And I understood that it did not matter how brave our soldiers were, how superior our tanks, or how clever our tactics, the enemy could simply bury us under a mountain of high explosive dropped from the sky. It was a lesson the German army would learn again and again over the next 9 bitter months. In an age of total air supremacy, ground formations without effective air cover were not armies, they were simply targets. Flight Lieutenant John Baldwin flew 63 more sorties before the war ended, many of them unleashing RP-3s against German ground targets. He survived the war, returning to a civilian life far removed from the violent skies over France, and passed away in 2003 at the age of 82. In an interview with a military historian in 1997, he was asked about the Mortain mission. He offered a small, wry smile. "We were young, we were frightened, and we had no real idea of the strategic importance of what we were doing at the time. We were just doing our job. Go in low, fire your rockets, pray the ack doesn't get you, and get home for tea and a debrief, ready to do it all again the next day." It was only years later I understood we'd taken part in one of the turning points of the Normandy campaign. The interviewer asked if the RP-3 rockets were truly as effective as the stories claimed. Baldwin chuckled. "They were horribly inaccurate things. You'd fire a ripple of 8 and hope that maybe 1 or 2 got somewhere near the target. But there were so many of us, firing so many rockets, that in the end, it didn't seem to matter. It was like fishing with dynamite. You don't need to be a particularly good shot if you use a big enough bomb." It was, perhaps, the most fitting epitaph ever given for the weapon, and the doctrine,